Crystal Ball College Football. I'm your host, Grayson Grunhafer, and of course, today we're talking about the national championship, the absolute beatdown that was Georgia over TCU, 65-7. What a game. I mean, this was just one of those where you turn the game on and you go through the first quarter and immediately it already starts to be a blowout, 17-7 after the first quarter. Got a lot worse in the second quarter as Georgia won that quarter 21-0, 38-7 at halftime. And it was over by then. It was pretty much over in the first quarter, but there's a lot to kind of dive in here. And I think the first thing that I want to do, and I was kind of debating whether to go through some stats on this first or just talk about the historical context of this, because it's unprecedented. And when I was watching the game, 38-7 at halftime, I was kind of thinking to myself, okay, is this the biggest blowout ever, in a national championship game as far as college football goes? And it was getting there. It was getting very, very close, even just with the score at halftime. You figured maybe in the second half, Georgia will just run the football, waste some time. Maybe TCU will score a touchdown here or there. Yeah, that did not happen at all. This was one of those games where Georgia they didn't take their foot off the gas. And if you watched them play Tennessee earlier in the year, you could have clearly, you could have told that Georgia probably could have won that game by 30 points, maybe high 20s, but they were in control in a very similar way. But in this game, they just kept on running the football. So historically, this is the largest blowout in national championship history. So since 1992, when the Bowl Coalition was established, essentially that means where we've had matchups of 1 versus 2 for the national championship. This is the biggest blowout, and it's really not close at all. So the ones that are kind of standing out throughout history during this time since 1992 are Nebraska beat Florida 62-24 in 1995. That's a 38-point win. That was the second most of all time until this one. 1996, Florida over Florida State, 52-20, 32-point margin there. In the BCS era, we had USC over Oklahoma in 2004, 55-19, 36-point difference. 2013, Alabama over Notre Dame, 42-14, 28-point difference. And 28 is really the number we've basically settled on since 2013 as far as what a blowout really is, because there's been 3 instances of it. In the college football playoff in 2019, we had Clemson over Bama, 44-16. And in 2021, Bama over Ohio State, 52-24. So historically, national championship-wise, obviously this blows those out of the water. I mean, just simply not even close. 58-point margin put up on the board. More historical context. In a bowl game, 56 was the record. That record was held by Army beating Houston 70-14 in the Armed Forces Bowl. Obviously, this year, LSU beating Purdue tied that record as well, that 56-point margin. The largest college football playoff game, period, blowout was LSU's 63-28 win over Oklahoma just a couple years ago. Even more layers to it, right? Georgia scored 65 points. That's the most since the Bowl Coalition, so since 1992. And they're just the third team ever to score over 50 points in a championship game. And obviously, they're the first ever score in the 60s, and one more layer to it. TCU is just the third team to not score double digits in a national championship game, joining 2012 LSU when they had the rematch against Alabama, lost that one 21-0, and 2001 Florida State, where they infamously scored 2 points in the national championship game against Oklahoma. So put all that together, this is by far the biggest beating we have ever seen in a national championship game, and one that is going to live on for a very, very long time. Let's dive into the stats a little bit, because this was a demolition, but let's kind of talk about why it was a demolition, or how we got there at least. The first place I got to start is winning in the trenches. This is where this game was not close. And when we came into this game, we talked about it quite a bit, the fact that TCU had ran the ball really well in their most recent games against Michigan and Kansas State. 44 carries. I'm sorry. Coming into this game, they had really ran the ball well, over 250 yards per game on the ground. But the issue here was they were facing a team that is loaded. And when you talk about Georgia, it's very hard to talk about them without talking about their elite run defense, and that continued to show in this game. TCU, 28 carries for 36 yards, 1 touchdown. On the defensive side, they had 0 sacks. They couldn't create any pressure on Stetson Bennett. And I think a big part of that was just the ability of Georgia to mix and match plays while having a lot of success. Really kept TCU from being able to blitz, being able to create any pressure. It was thorough domination. And then on the flip side for Georgia, 44 carries for 254 yards and 5 touchdowns. That's 5.8 yards per carry. They also had 5 sacks, multiple QB hurries on the defensive side. For that team as well, they created those sacks, and some of the time they were just bringing 3. Occasionally they'd bring delay blitzes. They'd rush 5 or 6 at times. They mixed and matched. But in general, they were just having 3 down linemen and dropping 8 and forcing Max Duggan to be accurate, and he simply was not. So the key broken stat in this game, TCU, the last 2 games, 481 yards on 78 carries, 6.2 yards per carry coming into this game. They averaged 1.3 yards per carry. And when we talked about Georgia's defense, we talked about this one specific thing coming into the game. Georgia allowed 436 yards the last 6 games leading into this game. That run defense had been absolutely legit, and it got even more legit after this game against TCU. Once again, don't forget, Georgia also benched their starters with like 13 minutes left in the fourth quarter. So they were bringing in backups and still dominating this game. Next on the agenda to talk about Stetson Bennett. This guy does not get enough respect. I understand he's not an NFL quarterback arm talent-wise. I understand if you want to say, he's going to be a late-round pick and just be a career backup. That's fine. But the guy is an awesome college quarterback, and he's awesome for Georgia's system. And at the biggest moments, this guy has been fantastic. So, last 2 seasons, so 4 college football playoff games against the best of the best, right? He's facing top 4 teams. He's facing the Alabamas of the world, the Michigans of the world, Ohio State as well. The guy has 1,239 yards passing, 15 touchdowns, only 1 interception, and he's completing 68% of his passes. So on average, in those 4 games, he's averaging 310 yards, 4 touchdowns, and way less than an interception per game. The guy's been awesome, and those are not game manager numbers at all. 4 touchdowns a game? He's a good one, folks. He's a good one, and at their biggest moments, he was really, really good. And in this one, I know the run game was fantastic, which takes a lot of pressure off of him, but he was awesome. His QBR was 99.5. He was 18 of 25 for 304 yards, 4 touchdowns. He also added 2 more touchdowns on the ground. He had 6 touchdowns in a national championship game and still doesn't get the respect he deserves. So Stetson Bennett, congratulations. You were awesome. Your receivers were really good. Brock Bowers, fantastic. Ladd McConkey was pretty much unguardable as well. And then the run game, which we talked about, just a steady diet of just running backs. You look at the guys who got carries. They gave running backs 6 carries. 6 different guys had carries in this game. 5 of them had over 5 carries. So they really mixed it up extremely well, this Georgia team did. So TCU side of things. When we came into talking about this game, we talked about some red flags with TCU. So let's go through those and just kind of talk about how this ended up happening. But TCU had allowed over 400 yards and at least 31 points 6 times this year. To me, that was a sign that Georgia was going to score points. And I think it was also a sign that this, maybe not to this level, 65 points is pretty ridiculous, but when you think about it, when you're giving up those kind of numbers to teams that aren't nearly the caliber of Georgia, it leaves yourself susceptible to performances like this where you could give up, 40-plus points or 50-plus points, and that's what happened. They were exposed. They couldn't stop anything that Georgia threw at them, and that was a huge red flag going into the game, and it really, really, played out. And their performance against Michigan in that first half really did not translate into this game. Another stat that we talked about a little bit, TCU 6-1 in 1-score games, and in games decided by 10 or less points, they were 9-1. People might say that doesn't mean anything. They found ways to win, and that's true. They did find ways to win. They found ways to beat teams in really close games, but it also tells you that essentially every game they played this year, they were playing a team that was almost as good as them. or at least on that day, they played almost as well as TCU. On the flip side, Georgia was only 2-0 in those type of games. When you're not blowing teams out, it does signify the kind of caliber team you are, in my eyes. You got to have some blowouts mixed in there, and the fact of the matter is every game TCU played was very close. 9-1 in games decided by 10 or less points is basically unheard of. That's never happened in a college football playoff national championship game as far as a team getting there with that kind of resume. But at the end of the day, they got there. But I think that stat really bared out as the luck ran out and Georgia was just a better football team, pretty clearly. The other thing that we mentioned was Max Duggan. Max Duggan had a great year. He was fantastic. He earned a trip, to the Heisman Trophy presentation. He earned all the accolades that he got this season. He absolutely did. But coming into this game, of the 9 games they had played most recently, 5 of 9 of those games, he was completing under 58% of his passes, including less than 50% of his passes in their last 2 games, which were the Big 12 Championship and their college football playoff semifinal against Michigan. We talked about that. We talked about the simple fact that he had to play better. We talked about the fact that Georgia had given up 850 yards and 7 touchdowns their last 2 games. They'd shown themselves susceptible to giving up yards, but only in the passing game. So Duggan was going to have to play well. But what Georgia did was they forced Max Duggan to be accurate. And 14 of 22 is better than he had been in their last 2 games, but it still wasn't good enough. He only had 152 yards, and he turned the ball over twice. He had 2 interceptions, and the run game was basically non-existent as he had 10 carries for negative 38 yards and a touchdown. A lot of those are sacks. I understand that. But at the end of the day, he wasn't effective enough. He wasn't efficient enough. The receivers couldn't get open, and his star receiver, who's projected to be a first-round pick, had 1 catch for 3 yards in Quentin Johnston. That's not getting it done. I think on the day, you can probably sit there and say this just wasn't TCU's day, and that's fine. But the play of Duggan leading up to this national championship game was problematic, and I think it did bear out in this football game. Outside of that, those are the stats that mattered. We mentioned, you looked at TCU, you looked at Georgia, you look at their recruiting rankings, you look at the guys that they have on each team, and it's very clear, Georgia's more talented. That's obvious, and I think coming into this game, it was going to take a lot for TCU to win this one. And unfortunately, they couldn't win in the trenches. They couldn't win on the perimeter with their athletes versus Georgia's athletes. And then on the flip side, they couldn't guard anyone either. And that defense finally had, that moment where they completely and utterly collapsed. And Georgia's defense rose to the occasion. Georgia's offense definitely rose to the occasion. And Georgia is the national champion. So that's pretty much it. That is kind of the summary in my eyes of what happened in this game and the things that really mattered and the historical context behind Georgia's 65-7 win over TCU. Later this week, I'm going to talk about kind of the trend for both Georgia and TCU, and then maybe talk about one recruiting nugget that I had from this weekend as well. But for today, thanks for listening to Crystal Ball College Football.